Hey guys, my name is Ben Zerko, and I'm here to talk to you today about JumpState, a React Redux abstraction. I'm going to jump through React Redux real quick. I know that we've all gone through it many times at this point, and hopefully it's starting to stick a little bit. Talk about JumpState, and by extension Jump Suite, and give some closing remarks. So just talking about React Redux for a moment, there are a lot of great benefits to it. It definitely simplifies the management of state, especially in a larger application when you want to load a lot of different pages and you want to do a lot of different things, especially in a single page application. The downside, I personally don't think it's that intuitive. I think that there's a chain of events that you've got to follow. It includes action creators, reducers, containers, components, action constants, etc. And it's just matching everything up and getting it all to work correctly can be tricky. With all those pieces, it's naturally makes sense that we would think that there's an abstraction on top of React Redux that simplifies it for us. Naturally, there is, and it's called JumpState. JumpState was created by Tanner Lindsley and Jason Maurer. It's a simple npm install -- save JumpState, and its sole purpose is to simplify Redux reducers, action constants, and action creators into a single intelligent instance. When I first read this, I was like, whoa, that's pretty cool. And then you start to see how simple it is to set up state and set up actions on top of that state. It becomes a really simple abstraction, and I really do enjoy going through it. And so we're going to start going through it now. Overview, we still have our components. They work just about the same way. We use connect to pass the state through to the props. We have reducers, but they're a little bit modified. We put our methods on top of them, and we make sure that we can understand what's going on. You're just able to see what's going on a little bit easier. The store, there's a somewhat simplified creation of the store, and there's a JumpState specific middleware creation. So let's talk about the reducer for a second. So we look at the reducer, we're importing state from JumpState, and we're exporting a state function. So in this state function, we have an initial state. So we're setting, say we want to set the initial state for this example, which is a counter to 0, then we can set our methods on top of that state. So for example, we have increment and we have decrement. And on increment, we add to the state, or we add to the count, which is on the state, and on decrement, we we reduce the count. Simple enough, right? So looking at the JumpState counter reducer continued, we can also take that increment function and move it outside of the reducer itself and just import that increment function into the state. And this allows us to reuse it multiple times. If we want to click one button and have it update multiple things, or not have to retype all these separate things that we have going. Pitfalls, there can be some confusion of the methods if you are calling up. One of the issues that I found, I will show you guys this later on a live code, is that if you don't necessarily set everything correctly, calling the same method twice can affect things that you don't necessarily want it to affect or think that it will affect. This has to do with how the JumpState is ordered on the back end. Look at the component; it's pretty much the same thing, except for the fact that we are calling up the increment function and decrement function on the counter state. So we've created the state. We will actually more specifically create the state on the next slide when we create the store. And we're just calling that up after we pass it through from the connect function. In the state combination, so with the store, we set our states. We set a variable states. And counter is equal to the counter state. And that's just what we've imported from our state function over here. And it's this whole reducer. And then instead of the reducer, the React Redux middleware, we are using create JumpState middleware, which is specific to the JumpState framework that we are given. So we've covered states creation, state implementation, and store creation. There's also interesting uses of actions, hooks, and effects. It's definitely simplifying a lot of or a number of the things that are going on in React Redux, some of which we might not have used that much yet, but it's pretty cool to look at. So the first one is global states and actions. If we import actions from JumpState, it allows us to call that that increment function. Even though we haven't set increment to actions.increment, we can call actions.increment in our component. So we don't necessarily have to call the exact right the exact right state that we want to modify, but if we know that that we want to increment something, we can just call it actions.increment. And I think that's a pretty easy way and pretty cool way to accessibly and globally access variables. As for effects, they build on handling side effects of thunks and sagas, having to do with asynchronicity and different side effects. Specifically good for third-party uses if you connect to Google or get responses back, things like that. And up until this point, there's something interesting. We haven't seen a single dispatch. We're not lining up a dispatch. We haven't needed to dispatch anything. And I think that makes it a lot easier to read. At least from my perspective, it just makes it simpler, and we're not dealing with that extra variable and that extra. We just don't have to dispatch, and I like that. For hooks, so hooks are a good way of adding something onto something conditionally happens. So we increment to, we're incrementing our calendar up, and we hit number 5, and we want that to jump to number 6, so that we never see it hit number 5. We could implement a hook, and that would look like this right here. So we see the same. We see the same reducer that we saw before, and we've got our hook on this is the third thing down. And if it's equal to, if the count of the state is equal to 5, we're just going to increment it one more time, so that we as the user, the client, will never see equal to 5. Cancel your effect, or cancel your hook. So say you're incrementing on every odd twice, and you want that to stop after you hit 10. My hook.cancel. Simple enough. Simple, easy to read, simple to use. I think this stuff is pretty cool. And lastly, for jump state, before I'm going to hop into some code, we're looking at we want to use a sandbox state, so something that's a little bit segmented off. We can just name the state. We can just name the state, so other counter or sandbox state or whatever you want to call that state function. And what that'll do is that'll remove the actions the ability to call something off of action. So if you want to call actions on increment, it won't increment. It won't call the increment function because that increment function is on the sandbox counter. So I'm going to show you some of my code, show you how small it is in terms of what you've got to do. We've seen it passingly as I've been talking through, but I definitely want to run through and change some things up and let you guys see it in action. So starting at the main.js, here is our store creator. And this is started from Bones, so I took out some things, but it's pretty much the same Bones application, JSX, that we've been working with for the past few weeks. You see our store, we're applying our middleware, and I've got a second counter in the state creation because that's going to be important later on, and especially in showing some of the confusing side effects. Go to our state creation. Here's our increment. Here's our constant counter, and we're exporting our counter. Our component, looks like any other React Redux component that we've used so far. And now if we go to our counter, increment, 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 decrement, 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 and it works just fine. One thing that I will note later in this presentation, the React Redux dev tools don't necessarily work so well. And if you look at, if we draw them up for a second, we're not going to see the different states pop up. And that is something that I'm interested in looking into and seeing if there's a way to get jump state to work with React Redux dev tools. I think that would be pretty cool. So let's go back and add our hook. We can see that in action. So we go back to our state, and here's our hook up here. It's commented out. And we're taking the action. We're taking this get state function. And logic, if the count is equal to 5, then we increment it one more time. Make sure this is saved. 2, 3, 4, and this should jump to 6. Yep, jumps to 6. And it's 2, 3 lines, and we have our we have that hook. And it's not, we're not tracing where do you have to put it inside the dispatch, where do you have to put it in reference to, these different requests. It's right up, just right off of the state. It's a pretty simple call in my mind. I do want to show you some issues with the second counter, in the cases where, if we look at constant counter 2, we're calling the increment function again that we've decided outside of counter and counter 2, and we are calling the decrement counter. So it's not named decrement, but it does the same thing as decrement does. And let's go, I'm going to uncomment this component, this part of the component. Here we have 2 counters. Now, remember, decrement is a different function than increment, but there's 2 actions on increment on each of the counters. And the issues I'm having is that they're both counting when I only want one to count. And decrement is decre, and it is different than decre, so it only affects counter 1, and counter 2 is different than counter, so it only affects counter 2. But because we're calling increment, it's the same function that we're calling, it seems to be triggering both variables. So that is something not a very hard thing to avoid in my mind, but definitely something to watch out for, and perhaps can be improved within jump state moving forward. So I've talked a lot about jump state so far, and let's see if I can get back to the presentation. Anyway, talk about JumpSuite. And JumpSuite is the expanded application framework that the creators of JumpState made. It's based around this state management system of JumpState, and is it's a pretty quick command line creation of an application, much like the Create React app. You install the command line interface, and you type JumpSuite new, and you type JumpSuite watch to start the application up, and it starts up on port 8000, and you've got an application. I'm still working on understanding that framework. It's definitely interesting. I want to better understand how it works with specifically React Router, because there were some issues I was having with it. And I'm excited to get back to you on that once I do understand it. But concerns, JumpState and JumpSuite are they don't work with React Redux dev tools, and I think that would be something to definitely strive for. Being able to have that extra input definitely helps us as developers. I know that with this framework, there are different ways you can console log, in different places you can console log information out. But having something that we're all familiar with, and especially other developers are familiar with, would certainly be nice. It's also just not as tested as the React Redux framework. So, while I don't foresee any issues with scalability or security, there might be some that I'm just not experienced enough to see right away. And with more use, we should be able to parse out. Closing thoughts, it's an abstraction on top of React Redux, and it simplifies our experience. And JumpSuite's an interesting extension, and I look forward to learning more about it. Again, they're newer and less adopted, so docs are still very much so still in development. They are both lightweight, not hard to install, not a big thing for any project you're doing. You can still install it. If you decide you don't want it, it's no harm, no foul. And to me, the biggest thing about them both is that they're built with intuitive user experience. It's not hard to program with these. It's not hard to follow the logic of what's going on, and that I really appreciate. These are the references that I used, and thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me.